A racist bank manager sees a black man walk into a bank and instantly assumes that he is up to no good, so he calls security on him. However, the manager gets hit with karma the next time he sees the black man walk into the bank. The bank's glass doors slid open as Malcolm Avery stepped inside, the cool air conditioning a welcome relief from the sweltering heat outside. Dressed in a crisp white shirt and tailored black slacks, Malcolm carried himself with quiet confidence. His neatly trimmed beard and focused expression gave him an air of professionalism. He approached the counter where a young Latina teller, Angela Ramirez, greeted him with a polite smile. "Good afternoon, sir. How can I help you today?" she asked, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Malcolm pulled a check from the pocket of his jacket, smooth and slightly stiff, the kind of check that would make anyone's day. He slid it across the counter with a slight nod. "I'd like to deposit this." Angela glanced at the check and raised her eyebrows slightly. "That's a nice amount," she said, her tone friendly and professional. She began typing in information, her eyes scanning the computer screen. Malcolm watched her quietly. He wasn't one to flaunt his success, but this check represented months of hard work on a design project that had finally paid off. A small smile tugged at his lips. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until a shadow fell over the counter. "Excuse me, Angela, I'll take it from here," a voice said, smooth and authoritative. Malcolm turned to see a tall white man approaching, wearing a suit that looked more expensive than it needed to be. His name tag read, Jeffrey Collins, manager, and the air around him seemed to shift with an almost imperceptible tension. Jeffrey stepped in front of Angela, gently nudging her aside. Angela hesitated, her fingers still on the keyboard. "I've almost processed it, Mr. Collins. I said I'll handle it." Jeffrey cut her off, his tone still polite but firm. He gave her a look that silenced any further protest. Angela stepped back reluctantly, giving Malcolm a quick, apologetic glance before retreating. Malcolm's smile faded. Something about the manager's sudden intervention didn't sit right with him. He straightened up, watching Jeffrey carefully as the man picked up the check and examined it with exaggerated scrutiny. "This is quite a large amount," Jeffrey said, his eyes flicking up to meet Malcolm's. "You don't see checks like this every day." Malcolm frowned. "It's a legitimate check. I earned it." "I'm sure you did," Jeffrey replied, though his tone carried a hint of something else. He placed the check down on the counter and crossed his arms, leaning forward slightly. "But you understand that when we see something like this, we have to ask questions." Malcolm's grip tightened on the edge of the counter. "What kind of questions?" Jeffrey tilted his head slightly, his smile thin and unconvincing. "Oh, just the usual. Where did the check come from? What kind of work do you do to receive this kind of payment?" "I'm a graphic designer," Malcolm replied, trying to keep his voice even. "It's payment for a project I completed." Jeffrey didn't move. He studied Malcolm for a long moment, as if weighing whether to believe him. The smile remained plastered on his face, but it felt more like a mask than anything genuine. "I see. And the company that issued this check, do you have any documentation to prove the legitimacy of the transaction?" Malcolm felt a chill run through him, despite the air conditioning. "Documentation? The check itself is proof. The bank can verify it." Jeffrey's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Of course. But, we've had situations in the past where people have tried to pass off questionable checks. It's important to make sure everything is above board." The underlying message in Jeffrey's words hit Malcolm like a slap. He wasn't just asking questions. He was implying something Malcolm had heard before in different forms, in different places, but it always boiled down to the same thing. "You don't belong here. You couldn't have earned this." Malcolm drew a deep breath, steadying himself. "Look, I don't know what you're trying to suggest, but I'm here to deposit a check. That's all." Jeffrey's smile faded. The polite veneer slipped slightly, and something colder took its place. "I'm not suggesting anything, sir. I'm just making sure everything is in order." Malcolm could feel the eyes of other bank customers on him now. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and he knew where this was headed. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He'd dealt with situations like this before, and he wasn't going to let this man bait him into a confrontation. "Not here." "You can verify it," Malcolm repeated firmly. "I'm not leaving until you do." Jeffrey raised an eyebrow, his eyes flashing with irritation. "Sir, I suggest you lower your tone." Malcolm opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Jeffrey took the check in his hand and folded his arms, stepping back slightly. "I think we'll need to take a closer look at this," Jeffrey said, his voice now fully devoid of any pretense of friendliness. He gestured toward the back of the bank. "If you'll just wait here for a moment, I'll be right back." Malcolm didn't like the way this was going. He glanced toward the door where two security guards stood nearby, their eyes trained on him. His heart pounded in his chest, and he felt the frustration rising. He knew exactly what was happening, and it had nothing to do with the check. As Jeffrey walked away with the check in hand, Malcolm leaned against the counter, forcing himself to breathe slowly. This was far from over. Malcolm watched Jeffrey disappear into the back of the bank, the check still in his hand. The air around him felt thick, charged with the weight of assumptions and silent accusations. His fingers drummed lightly on the counter as he glanced at Angela, who stood behind the counter, her discomfort evident. Angela caught his gaze and gave him a sympathetic look, her voice hushed as she spoke. "I'm really sorry about this. I've seen you around here before, and I've never seen anything like this happen with your transactions." Malcolm appreciated her attempt to smooth things over, but it didn't help. He nodded slightly but said nothing. His eyes darted toward the security guards at the entrance again. One of them, a tall, muscular man, glanced in his direction, then spoke quietly into his walkie-talkie. The feeling in the pit of Malcolm's stomach twisted. Minutes passed. The chatter of the bank's other customers felt like background noise, distant and irrelevant to the tension building inside him. Every second that ticked by felt like a deliberate delay, an unspoken decision to question not just the check, but him. The idea that he could be doubted for simply existing here, in this moment, gnawed at him. Then, just as Malcolm was about to approach the counter again, Jeffrey returned. The look on his face had changed. Gone was the thin veneer of politeness. In its place was something sharper, colder, and unyielding. Jeffrey placed the check on the counter, but his hand remained on top of it, as though he was guarding it. His eyes met Malcolm's with an almost palpable sense of authority. "I've decided to handle this personally," Jeffrey said, his voice steady but dripping with condescension. "There's something about this check that just doesn't sit right with me." Malcolm blinked. His frustration started to boil over, bubbling just beneath the surface. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, though his words were clear. "What exactly is it about the check that doesn't sit right with you?" Jeffrey's expression didn't change. "I think you know what I'm talking about," he said, his tone veiled but direct. Malcolm's jaw tightened. "No, I don't know." Why don't you tell me?" Jeffrey let out a slow breath, his lips curling into something that might have resembled a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's not play games, Mr. Avery. A check of this size, well, we have procedures in place for situations like this." "Situations like what?" Malcolm asked, the edge in his voice unmistakable now. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, though he kept them under control. Jeffrey's hand finally lifted from the check, but instead of giving it back, he folded his arms. "It's unusual for someone like you to be walking in with a check this large. We need to make sure it's not fraudulent." Malcolm stared at him, his heart racing, his breath shallow. The words hit him like a punch in the gut. "Someone like you." He knew exactly what Jeffrey meant. He had dealt with this before. Subtle words that carried a not-so-subtle message. "You're accusing me of fraud?" Malcolm asked, his voice steady but laced with anger. He couldn't believe how quickly this was escalating. "I'm not accusing anyone of anything," Jeffrey replied smoothly, though the smirk on his face suggested otherwise. "I'm just saying that we need to be cautious when handling such large sums of money. It's protocol, you understand." "Protocol?" Malcolm scoffed. "I've been banking here for years. You can check my account records. I've never had an issue." Jeffrey shrugged. "Times change. Protocols change. And this check, it just doesn't add up." Malcolm took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "What doesn't add up is why you're treating me like a criminal for trying to deposit money that I earned." The temperature in the room seemed to drop as the two men stared each other down. The tension was palpable now, drawing the attention of nearby customers and staff. Angela looked visibly uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot behind the counter, unsure of what to do. Jeffrey straightened, his smile gone now. "I suggest you calm down, Mr. Avery. There's no need to get hostile." "I'm not hostile," Malcolm said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm just trying to understand why you're accusing me of something I haven't done." "I'm not accusing you of anything," Jeffrey repeated, though his tone suggested the exact opposite. "But if you can't verify where this check came from, we'll have no choice but to involve the authorities." Malcolm's heart pounded in his chest, his frustration nearing its breaking point. He felt the eyes of the security guards on him again, felt the judgment in Jeffrey's every word. It was the same story, repeated over and over. Doubt, suspicion, and assumptions all based on the color of his skin. "I don't need to verify anything," Malcolm said, his voice cold and steady now. "The check is real. Call the company and verify it yourself." Jeffrey raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "That's not how we do things here. We'll be holding on to the check for further review." Malcolm's fists clenched again, and he forced himself to stay calm, though it was taking every ounce of restraint he had. "You're not holding on to anything. You're going to deposit that check." Jeffrey's eyes darkened. "Sir, if you continue to act this way, I'll have no choice but to ask security to remove you from the premises." Malcolm stared at him, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. "I'm not leaving until you deposit my check." A tense silence followed, and for a moment, neither man moved. Then Jeffrey took a slow, deliberate step backward, his hand raised slightly as he glanced over Malcolm's shoulder. "Security!" he called, his voice calm but commanding. Malcolm turned just in time to see the two security guards approach, their expressions unreadable. His heart raced, but he refused to back down. He wasn't going to let them push him around. "I'm giving you one last chance to leave peacefully," Jeffrey said, his voice low. "Otherwise, these gentlemen will escort you out." Malcolm took a deep breath, his hands shaking with the weight of his frustration. This wasn't just about the check anymore. This was about the constant need to prove himself, to justify his existence in spaces that saw him as less than. But he wasn't going to let them win. "I'm not leaving," Malcolm said firmly. "I'm staying right here until you do your job." Jeffrey's eyes flashed with anger, and he nodded toward the guards. "Escort him out." Before Malcolm could react, the guards were on him, grabbing his arms and pulling him toward the exit. His heart pounded in his chest as he struggled against their grip, the humiliation washing over him like a wave. As he was dragged out of the bank, Malcolm's voice rang out, firm and unwavering. "You're going to regret this." Jeffrey stood at the entrance, watching with cold satisfaction as Malcolm was thrown out onto the sidewalk. The doors slammed shut behind him. Malcolm's chest rose and fell as he stood outside the bank, the summer heat prickling at his skin. He adjusted his shirt and paced in frustration, still trying to process what had just happened. People walking by glanced at him curiously, but he didn't care. His mind raced with anger and disbelief. How could something as simple as depositing a check turn into this? Inside the bank, he could see Jeffrey through the large glass windows, standing near the entrance. The smug look on his face made Malcolm's blood boil. He wanted to storm back in and demand that his check be deposited, but he knew the security guards would be on him in seconds. Instead, Malcolm stood his ground outside the door, breathing deeply to calm himself. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out, briefly glancing at the screen. It was a work message, something that suddenly felt trivial compared to the storm swirling inside him. He glanced back at the bank and caught the eye of Angela Ramirez, the teller who had originally tried to help him. She looked distressed, almost apologetic, but she was powerless to do anything. He could tell that she knew the situation was wrong, but there was only so much she could do against someone like Jeffrey. Before Malcolm could decide his next move, the bank's door swung open, and Jeffrey stepped out. His polished shoes clicked on the pavement, and he straightened his suit jacket, acting as though he owned the sidewalk just as much as he did the bank. "Are we still doing this, Mr. Avery?" Jeffrey said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I thought we made it clear inside. Your check isn't being deposited until we verify everything. You can come back later if you want, but causing a scene out here isn't going to change anything." Malcolm clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm, though his frustration was evident in every breath he took. "This isn't about the check, and you know it." Jeffrey raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "Oh? What do you think it's about then? You saw a black man walk into your bank with a big check, and you decided that there's no way it could be real," Malcolm said, his voice low but intense. "That's what this is about." Jeffrey's expression hardened. "Watch your tone, Mr. Avery. I don't appreciate being accused of something that has no basis in reality." "There's no basis in reality for what you're doing to me either," Malcolm shot back. "I came in to deposit a check, and now I'm being treated like a criminal." "You're being treated according to our policies," Jeffrey said smoothly. "We have procedures in place for verifying large sums of money. You of all people should understand that." "Me of all people?" Malcolm repeated, his voice rising. "You mean black people, right? That's what you're trying to say." Jeffrey's eyes narrowed, but he kept his calm facade. "Sir, you're making this about race, but that's not what's happening here. I'm simply following the rules. Rules that don't seem to apply when someone else walks in with the same check," Malcolm countered. "I've watched people walk out of that bank with way more than I'm asking for, and you didn't even blink." Jeffrey took a step closer, his eyes hardening. "I suggest you leave before this gets worse for you. You're causing a disturbance, and I won't hesitate to call the police if you continue." The mention of the police hit Malcolm like a bucket of ice water, but it didn't stop him. If anything, it fueled his anger further. He wasn't backing down, not after everything that had just happened. "I'm not going anywhere," Malcolm said, his voice steady. "You can call whoever you want, but I'm not going to let you treat me like this." Jeffrey's smirk returned, and he stepped back, folding his arms across his chest. "Fine. Have it your way." Malcolm's heart raced as Jeffrey pulled out his phone, dialing a number with deliberate slowness. He could hear the faint sound of the phone ringing, then a brief pause before Jeffrey spoke. "Yes, this is Jeffrey Collins at First National Bank. I have a situation here. A man refusing to leave after causing a disturbance inside the bank. I think it would be best if an officer came by to handle the situation. Malcolm could hardly believe what he was hearing. His body tensed as Jeffrey shot him a satisfied look, as though daring him to do something about it. It was as if the manager had been waiting for this moment, relishing the idea of putting Malcolm in his place. Jeffrey ended the call and pocketed his phone, turning back to Malcolm. "You've made your point clear, Mr. Avery. The police will be here soon to deal with it." Malcolm shook his head, disbelief flooding him. "This isn't over. You'll regret this." Jeffrey chuckled softly, the sound infuriatingly smug. "We'll see." Malcolm turned away, pacing again as he tried to collect his thoughts. He could see people inside the bank watching, whispering among themselves. Some of them looked concerned, others curious, but none of them intervened. The entire world felt like it was closing in on him, like he was being forced into a corner he couldn't escape from. The seconds ticked by, and soon, Malcolm heard the unmistakable sound of sirens in the distance. His stomach knotted with anxiety, but he kept his head held high. He wasn't going to let Jeffrey or anyone else strip him of his dignity. As the sirens grew louder, Malcolm braced himself for what was coming next. The sirens stopped abruptly, their wailing cut short as the police car pulled up to the curb. Malcolm stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest as two uniformed officers stepped out of the car. One was tall and broad-shouldered, while the other, a bit shorter, wore an expression that could only be described as weary indifference. Both of them approached with slow, deliberate steps, their eyes fixed on Malcolm as if he were already guilty. Jeffrey stood off to the side, arms folded across his chest, his face twisted into a smug smile. He gave the officers a small wave, motioning toward Malcolm as though he were handing over a problem that needed to be dealt with. "Officers," Jeffrey began, his voice smooth and calm, "this is the man I called you about. He was inside the bank, causing a disturbance and refusing to leave after we asked him multiple times. I'd appreciate it if you could handle the situation." The taller of the two officers, Officer Daniels, turned his attention to Malcolm, sizing him up in a way that made Malcolm's skin crawl. "Is that true?" Daniels asked, his voice flat. Malcolm opened his mouth to speak, but the frustration and anger that had been building inside him all afternoon made his words come out sharper than intended. "No, it's not true. I wasn't causing a disturbance. All I did was try to deposit a check, and this guy decided to accuse me of fraud for no reason." Daniels raised an eyebrow, glancing over at Jeffrey, who gave a slight shrug. "He's lying," Jeffrey said, his voice sickeningly calm. "We have protocols for situations like this, and he refused to cooperate." Malcolm's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to take a deep breath. "The check is real. If you call the company that issued it, they'll tell you the same thing. This is just about him not believing I could have that kind of money." Officer Daniels exchanged a look with his partner, Officer Green, who gave a small nod as though to say, "Let's get this over with." Daniels then turned back to Malcolm. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to step aside while we sort this out. But for now, I need you to calm down." Malcolm's frustration boiled over. "I am calm," he said, though the tension in his voice betrayed him. "I've been calm this whole time. It's him," he pointed at Jeffrey, who stood smugly by, "who's trying to turn this into something it's not." Daniel's expression remained unreadable, but his hand drifted toward the radio clipped to his shoulder. "I need you to step away from the building, sir," he said again, his voice firmer this time. "If you don't comply, we'll have to take you in." Malcolm's eyes widened in disbelief. "Take me in? For what? Trying to cash a check?" Officer Green stepped forward now, his posture tense. "Look, you can cooperate or we can escalate this. It's up to you." Malcolm felt trapped. He looked from the officers to Jeffrey, who was watching with cold satisfaction, and back to the officers again. His heart pounded in his chest, but he knew there was no winning here. The odds were stacked against him. If he didn't comply, he'd end up in handcuffs, or worse. With a frustrated sigh, Malcolm raised his hand slightly, taking a step back. "Fine, I'll step aside. But this is wrong, and you know it." Officer Daniels gestured toward the sidewalk. "Stand over there, sir, and don't move until we tell you otherwise." Malcolm backed away slowly, moving toward the spot where Daniels had pointed. His mind raced, anger still coursing through him. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal simply for standing his ground. Jeffrey stepped forward again, his face still twisted into that smug grin. "Thank you, officers. I'm sure you'll sort this out quickly." The officers barely acknowledged him as they turned their attention back to Malcolm. Daniels spoke into his radio, calling for backup, while Green stepped closer to Malcolm, watching him carefully, as though expecting him to make a wrong move at any moment. Malcolm stood there, his fists clenched, his mind reeling. The humiliation was overwhelming. He could feel the stares of the passers-by, the silent judgment in their eyes. To them, he was just another black man causing trouble. They didn't know the truth, and they probably didn't care. After what felt like an eternity, Officer Daniels approached again, his face still impassive. "You're coming with us," he said simply. Malcolm's eyes widened. "What? For what?" Daniels didn't flinch. "We've received a report from the bank manager that you refused to leave the premises and caused a disturbance. We'll sort everything out at the station, but for now, you're being detained." Malcolm couldn't believe what he was hearing. "I didn't do anything wrong," he protested, his voice rising. "This is ridiculous." Officer Green moved in behind him, and before Malcolm could protest further, he felt the cold steel of handcuffs snapping around his wrists. His heart raced, but he forced himself to stay as calm as he could. "Let's go," Daniels said, his tone leaving no room for argument. As they led him toward the police car, Malcolm turned to look at Jeffrey one last time. The smug look on the manager's face hadn't faded. In fact, it seemed to have deepened, as though he was enjoying every second of this. "You're going to regret this," Malcolm said, his voice low but filled with fury. Jeffrey shrugged. "We'll see about that." The officers guided Malcolm into the back of the car, and the door slammed shut behind him. As the car pulled away from the curb, Malcolm's thoughts raced. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was certain: this fight wasn't over. The ride to the police station was filled with a tense silence. Malcolm stared out the window, his hands cuffed behind him, still trying to wrap his mind around what had just happened. He couldn't shake the image of Jeffrey's smug face, the cold satisfaction in his eyes as Malcolm was hauled away. It was the same look he'd seen too many times in his life, from people who didn't expect someone like him to succeed and who took pleasure in seeing him fall. When the police car finally pulled into the station, the officers escorted Malcolm inside. The bright fluorescent lights and the sterile smell of the station made everything feel unreal, like he'd stepped into a different world, one where justice was a twisted joke. Officer Daniels led Malcolm to a bench in the processing area and gestured for him to sit. "Wait here," Daniels said, his tone still cold, detached. Malcolm did as he was told, his mind racing. His wrists hurt from the cuffs, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the humiliation. He watched as Daniels and Officer Green moved toward a desk where a police sergeant sat, talking quietly. As Malcolm waited, he couldn't help but overhear bits of their conversation. Words like fraud and disturbance floated through the air, stoking his anger again. The more they talked, the more it became clear. Jeffrey had spun the story to make himself look like the victim, and now the police were buying it without question. Minutes passed, and Malcolm shifted in his seat, his frustration building with every second. He wanted to shout, to demand that someone listen to him, but he knew that any sign of aggression would only make things worse. He had to be smart. He had to stay calm. Finally, Daniels returned, carrying a clipboard and a stack of papers. He sat down across from Malcolm, looking at him with that same indifferent expression. "We're going to take your statement," Daniels said, flipping through the pages on the clipboard. "You'll have a chance to explain your side of things." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "Explain my side? I didn't do anything wrong. I walked into that bank to deposit a check, and your friend Jeffrey decided I didn't belong there." Daniels barely reacted. "The manager has a different version of events. He claims you refused to cooperate and caused a scene when asked to leave." "Refused to cooperate?" Malcolm's voice rose despite his efforts to remain calm. "He accused me of trying to deposit a fake check. I didn't cause a scene. I defended myself from his lies." Daniels sighed, his expression unchanging. "We'll contact the company that issued the check. If everything checks out, you'll be free to go. But until then, you need to calm down and follow the process." Malcolm's hands clenched into fists behind his back, his frustration boiling over again. "This is ridiculous. You're treating me like a criminal based on one man's word, and you haven't even tried to verify the facts." "We're doing that now," Daniels said, his tone almost robotic. He glanced at Officer Green, who had returned to the desk and was already dialing a number on the phone. Malcolm took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He needed to get through this. He needed to stay calm, no matter how infuriating the situation was. He could only hope that once the company confirmed the check's legitimacy, this nightmare would end. As Green made the call, Malcolm sat in silence, his mind racing. He wondered how many other people had been in his position, people wrongfully accused, their dignity stripped away by someone who assumed the worst about them. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to be reduced to this. Minutes passed, and Malcolm's pulse quickened as he watched Green on the phone, nodding occasionally, scribbling notes onto a pad of paper. Every second felt like an eternity, the uncertainty gnawing at him. What if they found a way to turn this against him, to keep him here longer? He couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what he did, the deck was stacked against him. Finally, Green hung up the phone and walked over to Daniels, handing him the notes. Daniels scanned the paper, his expression unreadable. "The check is legitimate," Daniels said flatly. The company confirmed the payment was issued to you for services rendered. Malcolm exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief washed over him, but it was tempered by the anger that still burned in his chest. This never should have happened in the first place. So now what? Malcolm asked, his voice tinged with bitterness. Daniels gave a small nod to Green, who stepped forward and unlocked the cuffs around Malcolm's wrists. You're free to go, Daniels said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. You'll be given a ride home if you need it. Malcolm rubbed his sore wrists, standing up slowly. That's it? After everything, I just walk out of here? Daniels didn't flinch. The check was real. You're not being charged with anything. Malcolm stared at him, incredulous. That doesn't change what happened. Jeffrey lied, and you all believed him without question. Daniels didn't respond, his gaze drifting to the floor. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done, just silence. Malcolm shook his head. This isn't over, he muttered, walking past the officers and out of the station. His body felt heavy, weighed down by everything he had endured, but his mind was already turning, already planning the next steps. He wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. The next day, Malcolm sat on his living room couch, staring at his phone. The words in the article he had just read bounced around in his head. The story was out there, but it was still small, just a brief mention in a local outlet, barely scratching the surface of what had really happened. The bank's statement about investigating the matter didn't sit right with him. He knew how these things went. They would issue a statement, let things blow over, and Jeffrey would continue in his position, smug and unrepentant. That couldn't happen. Not this time. His mind raced as he thought about what to do next. He had already been through enough. Hauled into the police station, humiliated in front of everyone at the bank, and forced to prove his innocence over a simple check. It was bigger than just him now. It was about making sure Jeffrey Collins didn't get away with what he had done, not just for his own dignity, but for others who might face the same treatment. Malcolm picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. There was one person he knew could help, Rebecca Cole, a local investigative reporter who had a reputation for taking on stories about racial injustice. They had met once at a community event, and she had given him her card, saying if he ever had a story, to give her a call. Without hesitating, Malcolm dialed her number. The phone rang twice before a brisk professional voice answered. Rebecca Cole speaking. Hi, Rebecca. This is Malcolm Avery. We met a while back at the... I remember you, Malcolm, she interrupted, her tone softening. How have you been? Malcolm took a deep breath, then launched into the story. Not great, actually. I've been dealing with something I think you might be interested in. He explained everything that had happened at the bank. How Jeffrey Collins had accused him of fraud, how he had been dragged out by security, how the police got involved, and how, even after it was all proven false, the bank only gave a weak promise to investigate. Rebecca listened intently, only asking a few clarifying questions as Malcolm recounted the events in vivid detail. By the time he finished, her voice was firm and determined. Malcolm, this is a story people need to hear. This isn't just about a misunderstanding at a bank. It's about systemic racism and the abuse of power. I can have a crew meet you tomorrow morning, and we'll get your side of the story on record. Are you comfortable going on camera? Malcolm hesitated, but only for a moment. He knew that going public would be uncomfortable, but staying silent felt worse. I'll do it. I want people to know what happened. Great, Rebecca said. I'll handle the rest. We're going to make sure this story doesn't disappear. The next morning, Malcolm found himself standing in front of the bank where it had all gone down. A camera crew was setting up nearby, and Rebecca was beside him, holding a notebook and speaking to him quietly about what to expect during the interview. The morning sun glinted off the bank's glass facade, casting a cold reflection of the place that had become a battleground for his dignity. Once the camera was rolling, Malcolm spoke. He told his story again, this time for the public to hear. He didn't hold back. He talked about Jeffrey Collins' thinly veiled racism, how the accusation of fraud was baseless, and how he had been dragged to the police station without any real cause. He recounted the humiliation, the frustration, and the undeniable sense that he had been targeted simply because of the color of his skin. Rebecca asked questions, guiding the interview, but it was Malcolm's voice that carried the weight. When the interview wrapped, Rebecca assured him it would be on the evening news, and that they were going to push the story hard. As Malcolm walked away from the bank, he felt lighter, but he also knew that the real battle was just beginning. That evening, Malcolm sat in front of his TV, watching the news. Rebecca had been true to her word. His face appeared on the screen, and the story was told in full, complete with footage of the bank, interviews with people from the neighborhood, and clips of Malcolm explaining exactly what had happened. The response was immediate. Within hours, the story started to spread. Social media lit up with people calling for action, demanding that the bank take real responsibility for what had happened. Hashtags like Launch Justice for Malcolm and Launch Fire Collins began trending, and more news outlets picked up the story. The next morning, Malcolm's phone buzzed with notifications. Friends, family, and even strangers reached out to offer support, many sharing similar stories of discrimination. But one message stood out, a statement from the bank's corporate office. First National Bank does not tolerate discriminatory practices in any form. We are conducting an internal review and have suspended Mr. Jeffrey Collins pending further investigation. We are committed to ensuring that all of our customers are treated with respect and dignity. We will take appropriate action based on the findings of the review. Malcolm read the statement twice. It was a start, but he wasn't satisfied yet. Jeffrey had been suspended, but Malcolm wanted to see him gone for good. He picked up his phone and sent a quick message to Rebecca. Keep the pressure on. They're trying to wait this out. By the end of the week, the bank was forced to issue another statement, this time more direct. After completing our internal investigation, we have terminated Mr. Jeffrey Collins' employment with First National Bank. We deeply regret the incident and are taking steps to ensure that such an event never happens again. We apologize to Mr. Malcolm Avery and will be conducting additional training for all employees to prevent discrimination. Malcolm read the statement slowly, letting the words sink in. Jeffrey was gone, fired. His attempts to humiliate Malcolm had backfired spectacularly, and now he was the one facing public disgrace. It wasn't just a victory for Malcolm, it was a statement to anyone who thought they could get away with the same kind of behavior. He sat back in his chair, feeling a sense of satisfaction settle over him. He had done it. He had fought back, and he had won. The news coverage continued, with Rebecca doing a follow-up interview, highlighting the bank's decision and the broader issues of racism in institutions like this one. The story had grown beyond just Malcolm's experience. It had become part of a larger conversation. Malcolm knew there was still more work to do, more battles to fight, but for now, he allowed himself to savor this moment of justice. Malcolm stood outside the bank, the same glass doors he had been thrown out of just a week ago gleaming in the sunlight. But this time, everything felt different. The weight of injustice that had pressed down on him was gone, replaced by a quiet satisfaction. The fight had been long, the struggle exhausting, but now, he was returning on his own terms. With a deep breath, Malcolm pushed open the doors and stepped inside. The bank's atmosphere was hushed, a far cry from the busy chatter that had filled the room the day he'd first walked in. He could feel eyes on him, bank employees and a few customers recognizing him from the news coverage, but he didn't care. Today was about closure. As Malcolm approached the counter, he spotted him, Jeffrey Collins. The former manager stood by his desk in the corner of the bank, a cardboard box in front of him. His face was pale, drawn with defeat as he methodically packed up his belongings. The man who had stood so smugly over Malcolm was now reduced to this, packing up, powerless, his career in ruins. Malcolm walked up to the counter where Angela stood. She looked more relaxed than the last time he had seen her, though her eyes widened slightly when she realized who had just walked in. "Malcolm," she greeted him with a small smile, her voice a mix of warmth and apology. "What can I do for you today?" Malcolm returned her smile, but his focus was already drifting toward Jeffrey, who had noticed his arrival. The manager's hands froze over the box for a second, his eyes narrowing when they met Malcolm's. There was no hiding from what had happened. Jeffrey knew it, and Malcolm knew it too. "I'd like to cash my check," Malcolm said, his tone calm but firm. "The one I wasn't able to deposit last time." Angela nodded quickly, already moving to process the transaction. "Of course," she said. "I'll take care of it right away." Malcolm handed over the check, the same check that had started everything. He turned slightly, facing Jeffrey, who was now standing still, watching the scene unfold. The tension in the air was thick, and the other employees seemed to sense it, keeping their heads down and pretending not to notice. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then, Malcolm took a step closer, his eyes never leaving Jeffrey's. "Well, look at you," Malcolm said, his voice casual but laced with satisfaction. "Seems like you've got your hands full." Jeffrey's jaw tightened, but he kept his gaze steady. "I'm packing up," he said flatly. "I'm no longer with the bank." Malcolm nodded slowly, pretending to inspect the half-packed box on the desk. "I heard. Guess it turns out that accusing people of fraud without reason doesn't really go over well." Jeffrey's eyes flickered with anger, but he kept his composure. "I was doing my job." "Your job?" Malcolm said, raising an eyebrow. "Your job was to humiliate me, throw me out, and call the cops for no reason? That's what you call doing your job?" Jeffrey's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I followed protocol." Malcolm leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "No, you followed your own racist assumptions, and look where that got you. Packing up your desk while I cash this check." He let the words hang in the air, watching as Jeffrey's face hardened with bitterness. There was no need for Malcolm to yell or gloat loudly. The sight of Jeffrey, stripped of his power, was victory enough. "I warned you," Malcolm continued, his voice calm. "I told you this wasn't over. You should have listened." Jeffrey's mouth twisted into a grim line. "You think this is some big win for you? You think you've changed anything?" Malcolm smiled, a small but genuine smile. "It's not about changing the world. It's about holding people like you accountable. And yeah, this feels like a win to me." Just then, Angela returned to the counter, handing Malcolm a receipt and the cash for his check. "All done," she said, her voice soft but filled with a subtle sense of satisfaction as well. She knew the significance of this moment. Malcolm took the cash, tucking it into his pocket. "Thanks, Angela." He turned back to Jeffrey one last time, his smile fading into something more serious. "Maybe you'll think twice next time before assuming someone like me doesn't belong. If there even is a next time." With that, Malcolm turned and walked toward the exit, his head held high. As he pushed open the glass doors and stepped out into the sunlight, he felt lighter than he had in days. He had faced down the man who had tried to tear him down, and he had won, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been in his shoes. Behind him, Jeffrey Collins was left standing in the bank, packing up the last of his things, knowing that his downfall had come at the hands of the man he had tried to ruin. It had been a few weeks since Malcolm's final visit to the bank. The chaos surrounding the incident had started to settle down. The media had moved on to other stories, and while Malcolm still occasionally received messages of support, the world had continued to turn. Malcolm sat on the front porch of his house, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the neighborhood. He sipped his coffee, his way of winding down after another long day at work. The weight that had been pressing on him since that day at the bank had lifted, but the memory of it lingered, a reminder of just how fragile dignity could be in the face of power. He glanced down at his phone, where a news article about the bank's newly implemented anti-discrimination policies flashed across the screen. They had been forced to act quickly, implementing new training for all employees and conducting reviews of their procedures. The bank's name had been tarnished, and they were scrambling to fix it. But to Malcolm, it wasn't just about the policies or the corporate apologies. It was about something deeper, something he'd always known, but had been forced to confront head-on. The world wasn't always fair, especially not to people like him. He had always been aware of the obstacles, the quiet judgments, the assumptions about what he could and couldn't do. But now, after everything he'd been through, he felt stronger, more certain of his place in a world that sometimes tried to push him out. His thoughts drifted back to the moment when he stood face to face with Jeffrey Collins in that bank. He had always known men like Jeffrey existed, men who would rather see him fail than succeed, who assumed the worst simply because of the color of his skin. But for once, Malcolm had been able to turn the tables. He had stood his ground, fought back, and walked out with his dignity intact. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments when he thought about walking away, about letting it go, but he hadn't. He had pushed forward, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. And in the end, it had been worth it. Not just because Jeffrey had been fired, but because Malcolm had proven something, to the world and to himself. It wasn't about the check, or even about the bank. It was about the fight, the refusal to let someone else define his worth. Malcolm took another sip of his coffee, feeling the warmth spread through him. He had come out of this stronger, more confident in who he was and what he could do. There would be other battles, no doubt. This wouldn't be the last time someone tried to put him in a box, to tell him he didn't belong. But now he knew he had the strength to push back every single time. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, Malcolm stood up, feeling the cool breeze sweep through the air. He pocketed his phone, the words of the news article already fading from his mind. There was work to be done always, but for tonight, he allowed himself to rest. He had fought the fight, and he had won, and that for now was enough.